Linguist and philosopher George Lakoff thought metaphors were more pivotal than we normally imagine. He suggested that they were not just tools and that our thinking hinged upon them. You see what I did there with pivot and tool and hinge? We rarely reflect on how deep they go. I did it again. Reflect deep. Our most enduring metaphors relate locations to time, putting future in front and the past behind. In Te Reo Māori, these are the other way around. The future is behind where we can't see it, and the past is in front where we can. Lakoff and Māori would likely agree that this perspective makes one less forgetful. Turned the wrong way, the English-speaking world endures along unsustainable routes, seemingly unaware of what led it here. This election is that way. It's in the repetition of the word back. Take back our country, or get our country back on track. Nostalgia, suggests comedian John Hodgman, is a toxic impulse. They just can't see that there is no going back. We can rebuild. We may even restore, but back is gone. It rains now like it never has. 90% of global warming ends up in the oceans, which evaporate more, making denser clouds and building rivers in the air. Some estimates put ocean warming at the energy equivalent of 432,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. National climate change spokesperson Scott Simpson has retained the climate position of previous national governments, that climate change is an issue, not an emergency. When that debate started in 2019, Climate Change Issues Minister Paula Bennett said that a declaration of emergency is appropriate for things like the Christchurch earthquake, but not for climate change. In 2023, insurance payouts for floods that year reached $3.5 billion. Still not an issue, but somehow it's on a par. So why have they settled on that word? Let's get into that. And as we go, look out for the dubious tech programs that make up the stacked turtles of National's Imaginarium: EVs, methane vaccines, CCUS. The emissions reduction target for transport requires a reduction in kilometres travelled by 41% by 2035, or a reduction in non-EV cars of 30%. Jack Tame repeats the question, will you keep that target? Simeon Brown repeats the reply, we are confident this will happen. If Brown had a yes at this point, he surely would have offered it. His confidence contains a no. And Brown goes on to talk about the rise in zero-emission vehicles that will happen over the next 12 years. The evolution of EVs is best understood here by the people at evdb.nz. They detail year after year of failed targets and call the current one completely unrealistic. They also say that the only intervention to move the line from linear was Labour's clean car discount, and this will be removed under a national government. Brown's confidence does not depend on maths, and so it rises. More cars will reduce emissions, he says, because they'll spend less time idling. When Tame asks whether he understands the term induced demand, the congestion that comes when you add more roads, his pride is palpable. He believes he does, and replies, the answer to induced demand is congestion pricing. So now, people forced to live too far from transport hubs and who work during business hours will have to pay a fee to sit in traffic. Brown is like a waiter refusing to serve a customer but charging them for the seat. Confidence fends the problem much like issues. The Nats don't seem to regard climate change as their responsibility. This, they imply, is something for the market to worry itself about. And who knows, maybe it will, in its own time, for someone. The good news about Modal Share. When you're at the wheel, transport emission reduction targets appear impossible. If new car sales were 100% zero emission now, we'd struggle to meet it, since we've only got 12 years and the average NZ car is 14 years old. You just have to look around to see what's really on sale. Rangers, F-150s, Hiluxes, Navaras. We haven't even considered the energy required to make the roads that are coming, or resurfacing the highways. That happens every 3 or 5 years. Open the map on your phone, turn on satellite view and fly over Auckland. Count the roads with 8 lanes or more. Now try the same for Oslo. You'll struggle to find more than 4. That difference is the number called Sustainable Modal Share. That is the number of trips by percentage that we're taking using sustainable means. In Oslo, as with most cities in Europe, this number is in the high 60s or more. I chose Oslo because Norway's land mass and population is similar to ours. General Motors began to buy up public transport in the 1930s, running it so badly that people would choose to buy cars instead. Their tight relationship with road builders and oil companies goes back at least that far. Their highway model took off in the post-war years across Australia, Canada and New Zealand as well. Our car ownership rates are as high as any, European microstates notwithstanding. The good news is that we have a lot of room to move. Since with the modal share in the low 20s here, it's just a case of raising it. Most cities in the world do it better, and they do it with mass transit. Intercity public transport is part of the solution too. If you zoom out on your map, you'll see the difference between the two cities extends to the nation's borders. In Norway, as with most countries, you can move almost by magic to other transport-laden towns for the price of a ticket. In Aotearoa, one line stretches from Wellington to Auckland, and it contains a lie. You're ejected in a car park at the north end, nearly a kilometre from Britomart. With no apparent irony, this single-purpose station is named The Strand, because it is stranded. We're so confused about rail here that the Herald once filled a weekend front page reporting on accidents that occur on the tactile paving at the edge of platforms. The same yellow dots that are used around the world, that you're not supposed to walk on, because you're too close to the train. Part of the European experience in Wellington is watching cars pull ahead of trains along the Hutt line. We opened a 7-kilometre train tunnel through a mountain in 1950, announcing Featherstone to Wellington in under an hour. It takes that time now. Simeon Brown's confidence extends to Intercity, our bus network, where 4-hour trips cost up to $100 and 4.5-hour drives can take up to half a day, sometimes heading for hours in the wrong direction. We used to have what other countries have, and most of those rail lines are still there. This map shows New Zealand's rail network between 1880 and 1940. The length of the network peaked at more than 5,500 kilometres in 1953. Now, voltages are mixed and the gauges are narrow. That's common problems around the world with common solutions. We can expect 150 to 200 kilometres per hour with the lines that exist. Electrification is more trivial than you'd imagine, especially over open land. If you saw a train along State Highway 1 between Hamilton and Palmerston North, you also saw a functioning overhead electric line. Electric freight's been running between those two towns since the 1980s. Finally, after considering the noodle-thin roads of Oslo, population a million, you might imagine rush hour congestion. TomTom will set you straight. Despite the many roads, if you're a driver, you'll move faster in Norway. And most of the time you'll be travelling carbon zero. Over there, they've been doing it for years. Dairy herds have grown over 100% since the National Party suggested that climate change could be fixed with a tractor. That was 2005. Lockwood Smith, the National MP, widely recognised as the host of academic game shows, a man with a PhD in animal science, took his own cows to Parliament. Everyone trusted him, why wouldn't they? The principles of anaerobic methane and global warming were long understood. Of course he knew. Leakage is the idea that if we were prevented from an activity here, somewhere else, someone might do the same thing but emitting more. Imagine asking someone on a train to move their bag so that you can sit down. They'll tell you about the passengers that hog 3 seats at a time, and then tell you the train is better off because they're just using 2. You still have to stand. Now imagine a war raging and the rails behind, and at the front, its front is closing fast, and that until you sit down, the train won't even move. This is the leakage argument. On a train, the rule is enforced by the conductor, and with climate change, that rule belongs to the Paris Accord. Best imagined as 200 people in a boat negotiating the quantity of hull to use as firewood. The Paris Accord is all we have to work together on. It enforces nothing and depends on good faith. So, when Christopher Luxon says we won't lower ag emissions after an ag research study suggested our meat might be lower emissions here than 4 other countries, but only while we allowed ourselves a different kind of accounting, what he's really suggesting is that we will ignore the Paris Accord. When hydrocarbons break down in water rather than in oxygen, there are roaming hydrogen atoms looking for somewhere to go. Nature provided the methanogen, an enzyme that releases methane, CH4 instead of CO2, carbon dioxide. And that's the problem. You can't stop the anaerobic part inside a rumen in the stomach of a cow, and there's no changing that. Science is trying to target the methanogen so the roaming hydrogen finds something less dangerous to do. Vaccine's an awkward name since the cow isn't sick and the methanogen is not a virus, but still vaccine technology is close to describing it. Inject the cows, the antigens live in the saliva, it winds up in the rumen, then it inhibits the methanogen. This vaccine is not ready, and we can't say when it will be. If it were to arrive, the emissions will be reduced by up to 30%, but never prevented. Ag research videos show the thrill of this problem. It is really hard. Still, when you reverse engineer to this depth, another solution presents itself. Why not do the fermenting outside the cow? We've been fermenting drinks for 5,000 years. We can use enzymes from the cows. This approach frees you from the cost of keeping a cow to adulthood. 60% less energy, 99% less water, 97% less emissions. The company Perfect Day beat the vaccine to the market years ago. Competitors, including Fonterra, are working on technologies like that now. Fonterra is also investigating other plant-based uses for their facilities. But why even have a milk facility like that so far from the market? When it comes to that, why not do the fermenting in China or Europe? Listen again to Chris Luxon talk about farming. Consider the consequences of his nostalgia. In the Cold War years, another nuclear warhead here or there made little difference because there were enough to kill us 7 times over, armed and ready. Oil reserves are much the same. In 2011, James Hansen released a study showing that discovered reserves were already 5 times the quantity required to push us past dangerous tipping points. We can expect that multiplier to be larger now. Steve Cole, the writer of Private Empires, and Naomi Klein offer the same reason. Oil companies live and die on the size of their reserves. That correlates to the share market price. It's got nothing really to do with extraction, not directly. This is all about trusting in a plan. The plan we've been working for is that created by the Climate Commission, but by declaring a reversal of the offshore exploration ban, the National Party signed a preference for another plan, that of Energy Resources NZ, formerly PEPANS, the petroleum industry. And to be fair, this represents the enormous infrastructure that directs energy from wells around the world to every remote nook where someone fells a tree or sprays a paddock. This plan and the IPCCs have one idea in common, and that is somewhere along the line we're going to have to pull some of that atmospheric carbon back. It's harder than you'd think. Simple carbon molecules, CO2, CO, CH4, are gases, while complex ones, glucose and benzene, can be liquid or solid. To come back the other way, you need to return the energy that was released when the hydrocarbon was broken up. To that end, Burning fossil fuels is not selling our future so much as pawning it at a price we can't pay. And that leaves us with the current plan. CCUS, Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage. This asserts that despite the fracturing of underground caverns that once held natural gas, carbon dioxide gas might safely be stored down there. The oil industry assures us that CO2 gas will last down there safe and held despite all the fracturing. Their evidence is the 10 years or so since they've been doing this, and the lack of evidence of it leaking, but it needs to stay there for thousands of years. And how to even measure whether the stuff is not leaking is a big question. When asked who will pay for CCUS, National's Nicola Willis flatly refused to answer, saying the technology was too premature to think about. But still, once the exploration ban is reversed, CCUS is the energy plan. There's plenty of gas in Taranaki and they're looking for plausible new ways to get at it. Under the last issues-based administration, it was gas peaker power plants, and under another will mostly involve hydrogen, the Trojan horse of energy transition. Hydrogen itself is clean, but it can be prepared cheaply with fossil fuels. Open that 100-page energy resources plan and start a search on CCUS. It appears more than 200 times. You may litigate for the separation of church and state, but faith abides. The National Party moved with the exit of Bill English from its Catholic roots to something more evangelical. English's closing speech quoted J.K. Baxter, who presumably turned clockwise in the place where he was laid. Both religions expressed a commitment to the phases of empire. For the Catholics, it was the doctrine of discovery, opening up other people's land. And to the newer generation, it's a prosperity gospel, which asserts that no matter how your neighbour is faring, you can do all right for yourself. These beliefs go somewhere older and deeper, and alternatives to them are masked and crushed by power and privilege. Marlowe takes a riverboat deep into the Congo. At the start, he calls the Africans savage. After meeting Kurtz, he decides that everyone is savage. In his lifetime, Joseph Conrad sold very few copies of Heart of Darkness, but it became the debilitating just so story of the century to come. But just look at the bodies. Not everyone is savage. From the Garden of Eden to Cormac McCarthy through the hero's journey and into prestige television, the line rarely breaks. It suggests that we can't change, that the present is not just wrong, it's also inevitable. From Steven Pinker to Christopher Nolan, we're warned not to imagine better. This is as good as we get. If that were true, will we ever have the faith in one another that we're going to need? If we're to break the spell at all, it may be by listening to those who can write back. Chinua Achebe, Jen Reese, makers of the movie Muru. It's all there. Human affairs have changed and prospered in hundreds, perhaps thousands of different ways, and yet we tell ourselves they will not. We haven't always been stuck like this. If we expect to live in this world, we'll need to vote for people who can see that. If they held the past in front of them, maybe they would.